Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley renewing his request to question under oath the Clinton aide who installed the private email server in her home. This follows the revelation that Brian Pagliano was granted immunity by the Justice Department. Joining us right now for a Fox Business exclusive is former Whitewater Independent Counsel and former federal prosecutor Robert Ray. Sir, good to see you.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us. What's your take on where we are right now that we know that Pagliano was given immunity and this investigation continues?
Well, it's the beginning of the prosecutorial phase. You're trying to build a case. You start with someone that you think has relevant information. You want to know what Brian Pagliano knows. What information by the Clinton camp was shared with him? How did he get access to the State Department system? When did he get the passwords? Who did he get the passwords from? What conversations were had? And, you know, separate and apart from whether things were marked classified, did he have conversations with Mrs. Clinton or others on Mrs. Clinton's behalf that indicated knowledge about the fact that it was classified?
The markings are real important. We had Michael Mukasey on the show last week, former Attorney General, who said someone had to change those markings when moving certain documents from the government server to her own personal server. Will we get a sense of actually someone intentionally changing the markings, making things non-classified?
Well, wiping things or copying and pasting things into email. I mean, the question you'd logically have for those witnesses is what was said, what was known.
Why did you do this?
Why did you do this? Did anybody direct you to do this?
Right.
When did they direct you? How did they direct you? And who else has relevant information? So, you know, this is the first grant of immunity. You would expect that there may well be others. That will take some time to accomplish. So the immunity's been granted. This person goes into the grand jury. You get access to that information. You try to figure out who else had conversations. And then you go to those individuals and you issue subpoenas and you talk to their lawyers. You may have further grants of immunity in order to, you know, take yourself up the chain.
Robert, is there a precedent for a case like this of a public official taking public emails, government emails, and putting them on a private server? And if so, what is the crime? What would she be charged with if it does get to that point?
Well, I think the overall thing that they're looking at, you know, you can sort of figure out the crimes later, but you're talking about misuse of classified information. So that gets to the question of what the intent was, and that's what's been so difficult. I mean, you can clearly see what Mrs. Clinton's defense is, because she's sort of set the mark at, well, nothing that I saw was marked confidential or marked classified. And the question is, well, if it wasn't marked, or whether, irrespective of whether it was marked classified, what did she know? And that's only going to be determined by the conversations.
Is there a precedent for any other case like this? What's the roadmap that prosecutors have used in the past?
Well, I don't know about anything, you know, akin to a private email server. That one seems to me to be something everybody is sort of like mystified by. We've never seen anything like that before. That doesn't mean you can't prosecute in that area, but you have to be careful about prosecuting in that area if the defense is essentially good faith. Well, I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. You're going to have to zero in on the conversations to find out whether or not anybody thought they were doing something wrong by doing what they were doing. And just because that's in uncharted waters doesn't mean you can't prosecute.
This sounds, investigating this kind of case is incredibly complicated, and if you have to give immunity to additional witnesses and there's a lot more investigation that needs to happen, how in the can they possibly wrap it up in a few months? Or
you wouldn't be able to wrap it up if you're talking about giving immunity to someone leading to another person that you then prosecute to try to to apply pressure to get them to cooperate against other people. There's not enough time for that. I mean, I think the window here is a rather short one, meaning that this investigation, if it's going to lead to prosecutions, that's going to have to happen before October. There's not time for prosecutions, in other words, in that space of time. There is time to give people immunity to find out what they know and find out whether or not there's anything there that you can use in order to prosecute either Mrs. Clinton or somebody else, but not both. You know, you've got essentially time for one prosecution here.
My understanding, though, is that Brian Pagliano, he's getting immunity because there's people that know more that they want to bring to the stand. Is that accurate?
Well, that would be the reason. I mean, generally speaking, you don't give immunity to somebody at too high a level. And so that would be typical of an investigation to give immunity at a fairly low level in order to get conversations of other people. And then you can talk about potential prosecutions. But to answer your question, there's not time to give immunity at a low level and then have a series of prosecutions brought before you ever get to Mrs. Clinton. That can't happen in the space of just a few months.
Is the end game here a violation of the Freedom of Information Act, the intent to move this stuff onto a private server so you don't have to comply with FOIA requests?
Well,
that's a separate case.
I mean, I think that's a separate issue. I mean, I could see that as part of the investigation.
You just didn't want anyone looking at her emails.
I mean, I think that was what the intent was. I mean, I think she wanted to control the information and control the release of information, and I think she knew enough to know that potentially there's information there that could be damaging in the political arena, and she wanted to be able to control that rather than the State Department. Now, that's a separate issue from whether or not there was misuse of classified information.
Any comparisons to the Whitewater case?
Well, I mean, once again, we're in the middle of an election cycle. I issued a final report in connection with the Whitewater investigation in the travel office and otherwise during an election cycle, which was when Mrs. Clinton was running for the Senate.
Wow.
And there were a whole bunch of discussions between myself, my office, and Mrs. Clinton's counsel about making sure that any findings that I issued were done well in advance of an election so that it wouldn't be deemed to be or perceived to be political and unfair.
Sure.
So we've been there before.
Yeah.
This is the same thing over again.
Wow, that's amazing. Robert, great insights. We so appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert
Thanks
Ray
for having
there.
me.